Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Scott Hanselman, who is a software programmer, teacher, speaker, blogger, host of the Hanselminutes Podcast, and currently VP of Developer Community at Microsoft. Scott joins us from Portland, Oregon. Scott Hanselman, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
I feel if you have no fear about your software, then it's probably maintainable. If you are afraid of it, if you don't want to touch it, if you are worried it might not build, if you're worried that if you wait a couple of weeks, it might not build next week, then it's probably not maintainable. So I put systems around my software as much as I can until the fear subsides.
How do you think about that on a team level? How do you account for that? Everybody might have a different appetite for, let's say, risk.
Yeah, that's a great question. So everyone should have good vibes and feelings about their software, right? You should be talking to the team regularly. The inner loop involves also talking to the people. That's what a stand-up is for. Everyone feeling good about it? Last week was a good deploy. I thought that was cool. Anyone got any concerns? You don't get to complain if you don't speak up.
How do you help new team members build up the confidence to be able to say, like, when they're trying to make their mark as when they join a team? I just can imagine people joining a team be like, I don't want to. You want people to hopefully feel comfortable and to speak up, but they're in that early phase of getting onboarded. Or how do you notice if they're not speaking up, or how have you kind of approached that?
Yeah, so the trick is that the people who are, if you're asking them, or if you're taking what I just said as asking them to speak up in a group, not everyone is wired that way. That's why you're quietly checking with them ahead of time, prepping them, talking to them afterwards. How did you feel that went? Everything is about feedback loops. We talk about the developer's inner loop, which is the make a change, hit F5, see if it ran, make a change. Then there's the team's outer loop, deploy the thing, test it, don't crash production. But everyone themselves has loops, okay? Early in career, 25-year-old, it's my first job. Okay, I'm going to wake up on Monday. I'm going to think about my week. We're going to do a couple of deploys. We're going to have a bunch of stand-ups. On Friday, I'm going to think about how that week went, and then I'm going to do it all over again next week. All of these different loops is an opportunity to make a change. Loops are not like negative things. In the movies where like someone's trapped in a time loop, the awesome part is when they figure it out, and then they make a change, and then they break out of the loop, and they make the next loop better, right? Whether it's Tom Cruise or Jake Gyllenhaal or you, how are you making the next iteration, the next loop more successful for yourself, for the team, for the software? And people forget the for yourself part, the human squishy part.
On the topic of well-maintained software, do you feel like you would have answered that question differently, say, 20 years ago?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yes. People forget about people. There's just so much, it's such a squishier human aspect of things, like how people feel. Like, to put it in like young people terms, like, are the vibes there, right? If the vibes are not immaculate, then there's a problem with the software. So then what do you do to get the vibes back? Well, the build has failed the last 7 out of 10 times. Okay, that's not cool. Build should not fail. So is that a pull request gating issue? Is that a review issue? Is that a not enough test issue? Okay, how many tests should we add? Well, senior engineer says add 20 tests. Junior engineer says, I don't really know how many tests to add. I'll just keep adding tests until I don't feel sad anymore.
What's your current take on the metaphor technical debt?
Oh yeah, I think there's technical debt, there's emotional debt, there's actual money debt. Like, debt is a thing, right? But technical debt, again, is all emotions are rooted in like either two things, fear or love. So technical debt is just a fancy way of saying I'm afraid of the software because I'm afraid that I can't change it. I'm afraid it won't do what I want it to do. It is bit rot. All of those things are rooted ultimately in fear. Like, that's fear is the emotion.
What sort of challenges do you notice in, say, developers that are earlier on in their career and being able to communicate and to advocate for maybe getting budgeted time or resources to address that, say, bit rot or some other technical debt?
That's usually because if we take the fear analogy and like go as far as we can, they're afraid to ask, and the senior manager is afraid to give it to them because they're being pressured. from on high. So the whole thing becomes a very challenging empathy exercise where we all have to take turns being empathetic for each other. And I'm a big believer that the senior people, it is on them to be more empathetic. You can't expect a early in career person to be as empathetic as someone who's been doing it for 30 years. However, everyone has different pressures. Senior engineer or principal staff, high-level engineer has a responsibility to ship the whole thing, while junior engineer has a responsibility to ship like a feature. But if senior engineer effectively leaks their fear out, they don't realize that fear kind of like rolls downhill and then it becomes infectious. And if you can tell that the senior principal staff person is stressed, then it's just going to stress you out, and then you get into a fear loop. And again, we talked about loops and why they're unhealthy. You have to change them. If the senior engineer doesn't really feel confident, that lack of confidence is going to affect everyone. And that's where you got to start talking. And then it becomes an empathy exercise. Why are you feeling like this? Well, I've been here 3 weeks and I haven't done a PR. We really optimize time to first PR at Microsoft. So if you just got here, how quickly can we get you a win? Can I get you a PR in the next 3 days? Well, it took me a week to set up my machine. Okay, let's make your machine set upable in a day. Let's get you a spelling check PR. Let's have you in charge of, you'll have 5 PRs this week and they're all just spelling checks. At least you're going to feel like, oh, look, that green check in the CI, that was me. That builds confidence. And then once you can do that and you have a really good PR in the first week, then you're going to feel like you can speak up and talk about things in the stand-up.
Hey folks, it's me, Robby. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus they're certified ISO 27001 and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. I'm out of curiosity, how large of teams or people usually onboarding into? Are they several dozen people, or they kind of get put into smaller pods for a bit? How does one kind of get acclimated in a large organization like Microsoft?
It so depends. I mean, .NET is it's a couple of hundred, but it's a couple hundred what, right? Like one group within it, ASP.NET might be like a dozen, but then .NET all up might be 100 plus. But then there's also, it's open source software, and 60 or 70% of .NET is external PRs. So then a lot of the senior engineers are reviewing external PRs from other people, but then you might be working on a feature and that might be 4 people. So it's kind of like Russian nesting dolls.
Can you remind me, what year did .NET go open source? Do you approximately?
2006 or 7. I blogged about it. I can find the blog. I remember pushing the button.
What was that like at that point in time in terms of thinking we're going to start taking input, and I don't know if pull requests were necessarily considered that terminology may or may not have been used that much yet, or what was that kind of process like to adapting from an internal thing to being something that you're going to start accepting ideas from the outside, and how did that kind of change the culture there?
I'm looking here. So .NET Core was 1.0 was 2016, but MVC, which is our Ruby on Rails thing, was open sourced, I want to say in 2000, and the CLR was, MVC was 2009, April 2nd, 2009. We put it on Codeplex, if you remember Codeplex.
Don't.
Codeplex was Microsoft's GitHub before GitHub was a thing, before it existed. So this was like Subversion.
Was that SourceSafe as well back then, or what was it called?
SourceSafe was even longer before that. Yeah. So SourceSafe would have been late 90s, early 2000s. So it was a slow a slow burn. So I went to work at Microsoft about 16 years ago when I met Scott Guthrie on the backyard of Tim O'Reilly at Foo Camp, at Friends of O'Reilly Camp. And we were talking about doing open source and what open source would look like at Microsoft. And he wanted to do a Ruby on Rails kind of a MVC framework. So I came and a bunch of folks were working on, like Phil Hack and Glenn Block and David Ebo and just a ton of folks working on a model view controller system. And then they said, well, hey, what if it was open source? And then we had to ask ourselves, what is the difference between open source and source opened? Because Microsoft historically had a mediocre track record of doing source opened. And that is like, hey, here's a zip file, enjoy. And then we'll remove the interesting bits. Because like .NET, people don't realize this, but .NET was source opened from like jump, like 2001, 2002. But it was called Rotor, R-O-T-O-R. And it was basically a attempt at getting people in academia to care the way that they cared about Java. So Java was more open, but Microsoft basically took the jitter, the just-in-time compiler, and the garbage collector and re-implemented them with naive versions, thinking that basically the secret sauce was the jitter and the just-in-time compiler and the garbage collector. So we put like academic cheesy for loop versions, and then released all the code and said, here, you can look at this, you can use it for school, and we'll leave the hard bits as an exercise to the reader, and no takebacks. So like pull requests weren't a concept. We used to email diff files and patch files around, and then like, here's a patch. That was, 20 plus years ago. Then MVC was the first one to say, well, this is really open source. I think we released it as Apache or MIT, or actually it was originally the Codeplex Microsoft permissive license, and then we all realized that was nonsense, and then just went with a straight MIT, Apache type of a thing. And now everything's basically MIT by default.
Out of curiosity, what year was that Foo Camp?
That was the one when Larry dropped in on the back. He landed his helicopter in the backyard. Were you there?
No, I did not make it. I got invited one year, and I got horribly sick that week, and so I did not go. And I always wonder what my life might have become had I made it. But
this was 2006 or 2007. And it was the one where it was Larry or Sergey was so obnoxious. They landed their freaking helicopter in the backyard, and it was just a weird move. And then I don't know if, I'm not an Elon Musk fan, but I believe either he was there or Tim had gotten a Roadster that was an early prototype without the skin. So it was just the base of the Roadster without the outer part of it. And they were flooring it in the parking lot to see how fast this electric car could go and the torque of it. And this was when Tesla was at, because Elon Musk didn't make Tesla, these other two guys did, and then he like got excited. And when he got excited, all the other freaking billionaires got excited. But anyway, Sanofsky was there, who was a Windows chief, and Scott Guthrie was there. And this was, I want to say, a year or two before Azure was invented.
That sounds about right. I think for me, I think that it was in 2006 I got invited. I didn't get an invite the next year, so
it's a club. I don't like cliques and I don't like clubs, but that's where I met Guthrie. I knew him from before, but that's when he was like, "Yeah, you can work remote," and I've been working remote from Portland ever since.
So one of the things I wanted to dig in with you is Hanselminutes, your podcast. So I'm not going to assume that all of my listeners are familiar with it, but as of today, I noticed you have at least about 940 episodes published. How many years ago did you start the podcast?
Well, it'd be 946 divided by 52. I want to say 2006.
Are you doing it consistently almost every single week the whole time? Or
I have never missed a week.
That's impressive.
Every Thursday for the last 20 years.
How do you keep a long-term podcast like that, let's say, maintainable?
Well, so like I'm looking in my Dropbox here, I've got episodes done and recorded through May 23rd. I'll record another one later today at my lunch hour. That will get me through June. So I've got 7 in the can, as the kids say. I have a very great editor named Mandy Moore. She's available for editing if anyone's listening and wants a podcast editor. She's great. I put raw files in a Dropbox in a folder called Input, and a podcast pops out the other end. And that has been a joy. So knowing what you're good at, I edited the first ones myself, and then I said I need to get a pro. That was step 1.
That's an important one. I've never edited a single one of my episodes, and I think you're episode 172. I do not get them out every week consistently, but the same thing is like I throw things in a Dropbox. I've had 2 editors the time that I've been doing this, and throw them over the fence, and then they come back as a podcast with everything all packaged together. And I appreciate that. And I talk to other people that are doing they're starting podcasts, and they're all thinking about their editing process. I'm like, I knew that I would be a huge time investment, and I don't feel like I can do it better than someone else that can do this on a regular basis.
I think it's a good example is I use the analogy that you should know how to fix your car, but you don't necessarily need to be the one who fixed the car. So yes, I could edit and level the podcast. It might not be as good as Mandy, but it'll be passable. It'll be a perfectly cromulent podcast. So I can change my oil, but I've done it once and I get it and I don't enjoy it. So I will have someone who is a pro change my oil.
How has having like a project like this for such a long time impacted your own, let's say, professional development?
I always talk about the idea that I don't like it when folks call me and say, "Can I pick your brain?" And I hate to be a hater, so don't take it that way if you're a young person and you're like, "This guy's being a hater." But like, it's kind of sloppy and lazy to say, "I pick your brain." It's nice to say, "Hey, can I get 10 minutes of your time? I have a specific question or problem or thing I could use a little bit of mentorship on." And then you come with an agenda and you respect someone's time but I, for a very long time, wanted to talk to cool people and pick their brains because it is a natural human thing. But also to recognize that you can't just call anyone and, do that. So if you start a podcast and you call someone and say, "Hey, can I have you on my podcast?" their egos will not be able to resist. And the next thing you know, you're picking their brain for half an hour. But the benefits of that is you end up with an artifact that everyone can enjoy. And then you take that artifact and you run it through speech to text. And then you get a transcript that's searchable. And then you have 20 years later, you have 950 shows and 450 hours of content. And then you can build an AI bot on top of it. And everyone can chat with the Hanselminutes bot about the last 20 years of computing or whatever, right? You make a corpus of material. So that's the benefit. That's the same reason you blog, is to put good works out there. Otherwise, the conversations would be lost.
We'll be back with our interview with Scott in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and/or writing a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help spread the word. Also, is there someone you think I should have on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm and state your case. And now, let's get back to our interview with Scott Hanselman. I'm thinking about your podcast. Have you gone through the process of thinking about, are you deliberate about thinking like, there's these new technologies I want to explore and I'm curious about, and have you been very intentional about that, or has it always been more of like there's certain people that you really want, or is it a bit of both?
It's a bit of both. I think that having a formal editorial calendar and deciding what I'm going to want to talk about is fine, but can sometimes be disingenuous because it implies like a hand that is deciding. Like it feels very decisive, and I don't want it to seem like there's something behind it, like there's a plan. I guess plan isn't the kind of word. I'm at an unusual loss for words. An editorial calendar can imply a larger thing other than curiosity. The show is a curious show. So I used to be panicky, like I'm going to run out of stuff. But then I realized that interesting things happen every day. So like, for example, let's say I have no shows in the can. Right now I've got like 5 or 6. But like I'm at, McDonald's. I went to McDonald's this morning. I'm holding up my my $1 McDonald's Diet Coke. And I start becoming fascinated by the point of sale system, like the giant McDonald's iPad. And then I realized there's a human out there in the world that wrote that. There's a designer who designed it. There's a company that shipped it. Is it a Samsung screen with a Comcast with a Chromecast inside? Is it run Ubuntu? I've seen the computer in the seat on my Delta flight reboot into Linux. I've never seen one of these reboot. Is it running Linux? Is it running Windows? Like you can start, the systems thinking starts going. So now I'm going to go online and I'm going to find out who is the guy or gal who owned the project to get the giant McDonald's iPads running. And now there's a show. That's just living. You can find that in excitement in life, that we just had an eclipse right? Maybe I'll get a scientist on to talk about eclipse glasses. Or after the eclipse happened, everyone was Googling for my eyes hurt. Get somebody from Google to talk about Google Zeitgeist and why that kind of stuff happens and how they measure it.
That's fun. I like, thinking about you allowing that to be a thing that you can just continuously be curious about. And when I set this podcast up, my goal was I wanted to capture conversations with people that I hope would still be relevant in, say, a decade from now, because I want to talk about the day-to-day realities of working with legacy code, existing code bases, and what that's like, because I know that a lot of software developers come into the industry and they're kind of excited about the idea that they're going to be making things, they're going to be building new features and working on new products, but a lot of it is mending as part of our responsibility as well, and I don't know if that's always talked about enough, and so that was kind of the premise behind my podcast.
Yeah, so like here's an example of a show where I talked to some random guy named Robby Russell in 2008. So this is 16 years ago, about a new thing called Git.
I remember my very first podcast appearance.
So I hung out with you and Gary and Andy at Planet Argon, and this is April 9th, 2008, and you were trying to convince me about, man, this Git is changing everything, baby. It's the move, and I was not convinced because I was all about subversion.
You were very skeptical of needing local branches, if I recall.
Yeah.
Do you use local branches?
Of course I do, because it's the bomb. You win.
Just early adopter syndrome, I suppose. But that's such an interesting. It was funny because back at the time we were, GitHub was still pretty new, and a couple of our past employees went to go work down there at GitHub and stuff like that, and so there were early people there. We were trying to use Git before something like GitHub was consistently available, so we were having to do that with our Subversion repository, so we can use local branches, and it was a fun time. So, anyways, thank you for having me on back then.
But what's cool about it is that it is a piece of history. It is a valid conversation. It is a conversation that is still applicable 16 plus years later.
I also think about. I know that one of the things you do is at Microsoft is something called Azure Friday, which I think has. Yeah, so that has over 700 episodes, I believe. So.
Yeah, I have almost 800 episodes of that. That's another podcast. I do that one for my job, though. Although, one thing, that actually is not an official podcast. We do that on a shoestring budget. We have no budget. It's me and Rob Karen. We have no support from marketing or anyone. It's not literally part of my job. But because I don't want to stop, I won't stop. So it's funny, like, We've had different producers come and go. We have no editor right now. Rob is doing all the editing himself. So like that is very much a passion project, and I really wish I had budget for it.
I guess I'm curious about like when you do stuff like that, and that's stuff that I was able to look at some of that, public facing and such. Was one of the reasons Microsoft brought you in was because you had that podcast stuff, or you just were like, hey, this would be a really good way to communicate things internally?
People think like I was me before, and I will be me after. I was not hired like because I had a public face. The podcast is mine. I talk about whatever the hell I want to on the podcast. I do it during my lunch hour. It's on my own machine. Like they don't own the podcast. The podcast is me. Azure Friday was, I came to this giant company. Azure was invented, and I like learning in public. I'm a big fan of learning in public. Like Kelsey Hightower does a great job of that. Saran Yitbarek is a big fan of learning in public. I was a professor, an adjunct professor at both Portland Community College and OIT. And I've always felt like learning and having seeing your teachers learn is like just fundamentally the best way to learn because we're all learning together. I never liked the idea of like, look at me, I'm an expert, and now I will tell you the expert things. I think it's more cool to be like, hey, check that out. Look at this. This is awesome. So how am I going to go and learn Azure at this big giant company that they hired me into? I guess I'll just start showing up in people's offices with a camera, and then I'll film it, and then we'll all learn together. So like literally today, this is being recorded in April, I released a 1.5 hour video with the engineer that worked on LINQ, language integrated querying within, it's basically an integrated query language within C#. It's one of the most well thought of and most impressive parts of C# as a language. We basically sat for 90 minutes, no cuts, no edits, and he rewrote it from scratch, both initially non-performant and then ran performance tests and then got it down to like not nanoseconds, but microseconds, millionths of a seconds in a loop. He's a performance engineer. Did the whole thing live. And he taught me, in air quotes, LINQ. So I play the foil. I'm Mr. Rogers, I'm Ted Lasso, and he teaches me this, and we move the conversation forward together. And people are freaking loving it. Like, that's a great way to have one of the world's great experts teach someone, but I still have to kind of pretend that I don't know what I'm talking about. So it's a constant balancing act, because he's teaching me and I represent the audience. So I've decided that that is a good model for learning, if that makes sense. Because I know what he's doing, and then I can ask a question that gently guides him from a pedagogical perspective into the correct thing, because he's not a teacher, he's an expert, and that's a difference.
No, that's interesting. I'm going to have to do some reflecting on that and thinking about how I exhibit my curiosity on behalf of the average listener of the podcast. I think that's interesting to be a little bit more intentional about that.
There's an empathy that is required where you have to remember what it was like to be early and to be 20 years ago. So you're having a chat and then someone calls out an acronym, blah, 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 TCP/IP, DNS. That is now a barrier. That is a barrier. I don't know what that acronym is, right? If you're talking about Rails and you say, what is it called? Not active record. Hey, by the way, for our listeners who may not be familiar, active record is that ORM, with the history. Like those little moments, someone is nodding and going, oh, I'm so glad that they expanded that acronym because I had no idea what that was. I'll be on a call with someone, like I did a video with like Michio Kaku. He then did string theory, and he was like something argon, blah 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 blah. And I'm like, just for our listeners, let's dig into argon. That's atomic number 18, isn't it? Right? That's a noble gas. It's a gentle. Oh yeah, actually, you're right, Scott. Let me just dig into that for a second. I'm not saying I'm super smart. I just gave him just enough information on argon for him to remind himself that he was floating away like a balloon, and I bring him back down. Yeah, it is absolutely 100% intentional. But it also involves me doing a lot of reading and being really prepped to, in the example just now, to know that argon is a noble gas and atomic number 18. Like that's prep work I did. And that's meant to then bring the conversation back to a 200 level, because I'm a big fan of 200 level content. 100 level is sometimes too easy, and 400 level is not accessible. So you kind of play Flappy Bird with your tech to make it appropriately leveled for everyone.
Hey again, it's me, Robby, taking a moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We've been helping organizations modernize, upgrade, and future-proof their Ruby on Rails applications since 2005. That's a number of years. It's weird to say out loud. Been doing this for a while. We've been riding the rails. Do you have a Ruby on Rails application? Are you part of a team that's struggling to figure out how to manage your technical debt? Need to deal with an overdue upgrade? Just need some new advice on how to use the latest technologies, but it might take you a bit to try to figure out how to get your way there? Get in touch with us at planetargon.com. Once again, that's planetargon, like the noble gas.com. And now let's get back to our show. From an outside perspective, just looking at something like your Azure Friday, and I think, oh, well, a large organization like Microsoft can afford to have people do this. And then sometimes I wonder if like the way that smaller teams thinking about how they're teaching themselves or sharing knowledge amongst themselves in their engineering team about like, hey, what are we doing over here? And maybe they'll do like lunch and learn type Fridays, or hop on a Zoom or a Teams meeting and give a presentation on something that they're working on. But I've always been curious about like more video-based things or like internal podcast type approaches. We have a client right now that we're working with, and they're working on some interesting like internal podcasts is like a whole thing that they're investing in to improve how they're communicating across teams and stuff like that. So it sounds like even somewhere like Microsoft is doing that with no budget, shushing bread. It's just a way that you're thinking about how you share knowledge. And so anyone listening that might be like, well, my team's not going to budget for that. You're still spending the time sharing knowledge, right? So it's still work time. It's just there's a production value there that I think you could either sit down and write a big long thing, or you could potentially, there's other mediums, I suppose, you could approach.
Things that are maintainable are also cheap. Right. And there's this funny rule of scale that if you do nothing, you can do infinitely. So Hanselminutes is sustainable because it only requires an editor and, minimal hosting. Azure Friday is sustainable because I get on a call with some folks. I go into StreamYard and I hit record. And I've done a lot of prep and I work hard to make sure that if you know what you're talking about and you can avoid even saying you can avoid editing costs. It's like literally thinking about stuff like that. Like if you fumble your words constantly, now you've got to pay for it later. So prep up front is cheaper than cutting later, right? So putting Azure Friday together is also inexpensive. I had a literal conversation with a guy today. We're doing this thing called deep.net, and they want to like assign an editor and produce it, and it's going to cost like $10,000. It's like, no, let me just get on a call and hit record. It'll be free. No, we can go and do a whole thing. It'll be highly produced. Finding that dial of good, fast, and cheap, pick two. And that's the trick. Like that's the old software joke. I learned that joke like in the 80s. Good, fast, or cheap, pick two. Applies to everything in life. So then the question is, you don't want to be mediocre. Nobody wants to be a mediocre anybody. But if you can do 85% and then iterate quickly, then you will get great material out at scale. But if you're always striving for perfection, you'll eventually accomplish nothing. There's this asymptotically approaching perfect. That's why it's asymptotic. You'll never reach perfect, and all you'll do is waste time in the high 90s. So I'm a big fan of like, put it out there, MVP. And with Azure Friday or with Hanselminutes, it's good, solid B+ work at scale. It's not perfect, but I'm not going to not ship it and hire an editor and beg for budget in the pursuit of perfect. I'm just going to ship the thing.
Just trying to find that balance there of how much prep work you do, and you're right on the editing notes, and trying to avoid even saying and that, because it costs you time, someone else's time to do that, and having something that you can repeat the process and it can be consumable and shareable easily with people on your team. So just helping people listening, if they're thinking about doing something like a podcast or different other ways of recording conversations that you have, like, I'm curious for you, for example, Scott, do you often have many conversations where you're looking at code with people and doing like pair programming where you don't have the record button hit?
With AIs like Copilot, we almost always hit transcript. So we're not necessarily recording the video, but we're almost always recording the transcript. That way, you're basically getting like a free executive assistant. You get like a free secretary. And that's a I don't like the idea of AI taking people's jobs, but like taking notes is hard, and note-taking follow-up is a pretty awesome, AI feature. And it's a pretty reasonable, eco-friendly one. That's different than like recording all the video and annotating it. So I'm always getting notes and follow-ups being taken. I do spend a lot of time with peers looking at code. I'm a big fan of 1 + 1 is 3 when it comes to like producing code and understanding code. I try to do that as much as I possibly can.
And out of curiosity, in your day-to-day work, are you doing a lot of individual contribution code-wise in your role, or kind of helping just shepherd people on teams?
Mostly shepherding. Mostly, I would say, I have my website, my podcast, my blog are all code that I work on, and that's me keeping multiple sites. I've got about 16 sites and 3 major sites that I keep running. So I'm carrying the pager for Hanselman.com, for the blog, and for the podcast, and then actually 4 if you count Azure Friday. And they're all CI/CD, unit tests, playwright tests, smoke tests, deployment. They are being run as if I were a business. That's me. At work, I'll do a pull request or shepherd a pull request. We had one in Windows recently. We fixed a bug in Task Manager, but that was like something where I identified it, did a bunch of analysis with the engineer, did the dump, but then the engineer owns the fix, and then I'm shepherding the pull request through the fix, and then I just saw it actually went into main recently. I'll do PRs on different websites like the .NET website, but we have engineers that work on that. So I would say line engineer work at Microsoft, less and less, but we are enabled though to do PRs. Like I could do a PR for Windows. It doesn't mean it's going to get in. It could get closed as not, that's stupid. Why are you doing that? But we very much have an inner source philosophy where we can use source internally, and we are also encouraged to do PRs to other orgs. I did a thing with Semantic Kernel, which is one of our AI orchestrators, and it wasn't working with Korean, so I worked with Anthony Shaw, who eventually did a PR, and he fixed some stuff in Semantic Kernel for Korean. So I think I'm a energy generator more than a PR maker lately.
A couple of quick last questions. I know you've got plenty on your plate today. Is there a non-technical, non-programming, non-software book that you find yourself recommending to peers that you work with?
Probably The Daily Stoic by Stephen Hanselman. Coincident, not related. I've been trying to get a hold of Stephen Hanselman. I want to figure out, I don't think we're cousins, but I think Stoicism and the general idea of you're not responsible for everything that happens to you, but you're accountable to your reaction to it is a healthy vibe. Most of the books I'm going to recommend are going to be not books on software engineering. They're going to be like, Andy Weir, The Martian, and all that kind of stuff. Like those are all software and hardware and engineering books at heart. Hard sci-fi, 3-body problem type stuff.
Awesome. I'll definitely include a link to the Daily Stoic from Maybe Not Your Cousin in the show notes for our listeners. And where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations outside of listening to the podcast?
So if you just Google with Bing for Hanselman or Google with DuckDuckGo for Hanselman, you'll find me at hanselman.com. From there, I am S. Hanselman everywhere. I'm on TikTok. I have a joyful experience and enjoy TikTok very much. I'm on Mastodon. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Threads. I'm S. Hanselman effectively everywhere.
I have sat and watched you talk with people on TikTok a number of times. If you ever see anyone asking what's your go-to terminal, that's me. I think I recently did that. I don't think you noticed it was actually me. You mentioned Oh My Posh.
Sorry, I was on TikTok live recently and there was like 1,000 people there and it was crazy. Oh My Posh is the best.
I know. I was like, ooh, you mentioned Oh My Posh. I'm like, so close. Well, with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Scott. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop.
Thank you for having me.